I was born in San Antonio, Texas in 1947, and I grew up in a family that was probably labeled lower middle class. My father was a construction worker, my mother was a seamstress, and she encouraged my father to move us to California because she had heard there was a lot of good factory work uh, uh, making garment in the garment district of Los Angeles. And she also felt that in California we could get a better education. So that's what we did. When I was around 6 or 7 years old, we moved to Los Angeles, California, where I grew up. And I started dancing at Belvedere Park in East Los Angeles, free of charge, thanks to Mrs. Aguilar, who didn't charge us because she was getting paid by the county to teach all these children. So I was very lucky that way, and my parents were very supportive of my dance life. During the in the mid-60s, there was a big political upheaval in the United States. Having to do with black people. I am proud to be black, that kind of thing. And that eventually sparked off a revolution in the Hispanic community, or rather the Mexican community, that we are proud to be. Chicano was one of the words. Now, the word Chicano has different meanings to different people. For us who were born in Texas, and my older sister and brother who grew up in Texas up to their teens, Chicano was a derogatory term. It was more of a term that was used in California and in the political movement of the late 1960s, the Chicano brown power that was being, we were being reminded that we were Mexican or of Mexican heritage. But we were not necessarily labeled Mexicans because we were born in in Los Angeles, or rather Texas, or New Mexico, or Arizona, or California. So we were, as a group, we were often identified as Mexican Americans. And that's what I grew up with in San Antonio. We had to, in school, we could only speak English because Spanish was prohibited, and so that's an interesting take, because we felt, in a way, we felt more Mexican than American, but to us, Americans meant blonde hair, blue-eyed, and beautiful homes, and upper class, middle class lifestyle. In my family, we could label ourselves either Mexican American or Latino American, which came later on. There's also the word Hispanic. Now, Hispanic also has different meanings for different people, but Hispanic is an umbrella for people that are from Argentina, from Chile, from Central America, from different regions in South America, and in the United States. So it covers a wider area of Latin people, which is another term that can be used. But generally the terms that apply to us is Hispanics or Latinos or Mexican Americans, or in the case of some people, Chicano. But I never really identified as a Chicano. And now that I'm here in Canada, I'm a Canadian, a Mexican American Canadian, if you want to put a label on it. I could possibly have indigenous genes or ancestry in my my background, in my history, because there's a picture of my grandfather, and he looks like a Northwest Indian. So, I mean, you can see by my profile, my face, that I look more indigenous than Spanish, even though my surname is Spanish, Nieto, which, by the way, is in the Jewish Book of Names, and I take it to mean that that had to do with the Sephardic people of Spain. In my family history, my great grandfather could have been more indigenous than because he was born in, I think, near Monterrey, which is relatively close to the Texas border, what is now the Texas border. And before, people that were in Monterrey, Mexico, and people that were in San Antonio were in Mexico because Mexico was not part of the United States. Eventually, Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico and California became part of the United States, but before then, it was all Mexico. So for people living south of what is now the border of the United States, there was no border then. We didn't cross the border crossed us. Frankly, I don't think I chose flamenco. I think it chose me just by proximity to flamenco music that my first music dance teacher, Mrs. Aguilar, turned me on to. And they were old Carmen Amaya albums, well, old now, Carmen Amaya albums, other Spanish flamenco dance albums, where I began to be aware of the cante and the guitar, because prior to that I had been doing Mexican folk dance and some Spanish dance. And then eventually, as I heard more flamenco records, the sound of the singing I found haunting and fascinating. So that was my introduction, really, if I look back on it, to the flamenco life. And I don't believe I live a flamenco lifestyle, meaning I don't listen to flamenco music and 24/7. I don't look at flamenco videos 24/7. I have a wider interest in music and in dance and in arts. So flamenco is just a part of my life. First, we were doing performances with Mrs. Aguilar's LA County Ballet Folklorico, and then I started doing little performances with a gentleman by the name of Juan Talavera. His company was the first one that I actually got paid to dance, and he also liked my choreography, so he let me do some of the choreographies for the company. And we would practice all year long, from January to July, to get a show going, mount a show at the Santa Barbara Spanish Day Fiestas, which are still going on to this day. But we would work all year, half a year, and then do our presentation there. We perform about 3 or 4 nights at the Lobero Theater. That was a big high. And then eventually from that, I auditioned and got work with Lola Montes, and then with Jose Greco. And then this was all in the 70s. And then in 1974, I finally went to Spain and studied flamenco. By that time, I was hooked on flamenco. If there was a point in my life where flamenco really took me over, it was in the mid-70s. We were very well employed through the LA County school system when they started the ICAP program, Intercultural Awareness Program, that brought a lot of artists to the different schools in the Los Angeles City school system. They brought flamenco, Spanish dance, Mexican folk dance, opera, puppeteering, ballet, and we would, for 14 years, we circulated around the LA County schools doing all these type of shows. And in the interim, I did concerts with Lola Montes and, like I said, Juan Talavera. And with Lola, we did a tour through the Midwest for about a month. Then we did a tour up here to the Northwest Territories and even into Churchill. And then eventually I joined Jose Greco's company and I toured with them for a while. And touring at that time was doable because in order to move a dance company, you had to put them in a bus or planes or whatever. And buses were cheap enough for companies like Jose Greco, Jose Molina, and to tour. But when the gas crunch came in the mid-70s, that killed a lot of touring for a lot of people because they couldn't afford to tour big companies anymore. But prior to that, there had been companies that were touring, even in Europe. When I first went to Spain, I was hired by Jose Antonio, who was one of my idols, to join his company, Ballet Siluetas, and he was touring Europe, and I went with him to England, and that was from there, England, I decided I was going to leave the company because I wanted to come back to the United States. So there was a lot of touring going on, and I grew up with the idea that if you were going to do something, you were going to do it as a company. Well, eventually that was cost prohibitive, so that we went more towards the ensemble. That's where Mosaico de Danzas grew out of that period. It was more, not a company, more of an ensemble where I would hire people to perform for certain gigs, and then once that gig was over, the company or the group kind of disbanded. And so when I came up to Canada, that was the mindset that I had, was more of a cuadro or an ensemble group. In 1980, my best friend Alfonso Bermudez died of cancer. He was only 29 or 30 years old, so that took a big toll in my life. He was the one that had encouraged me to go to Spain to study, so we both went to Spain together to study. He stayed, I left, and but as I say, he eventually died from colon cancer in 1980. Well, at that time in my life, I was footloose and fancy-free, and I was very much into the drug culture of Los Angeles or the West Hollywood crowd. We were doing acid, we were doing mushrooms, we were doing cocaine, we were doing anything we could get our hands on, because that was the lifestyle and the group of people that I was hanging out with. And then after Alfonso died, I did a tour to the Midwest where I met a guitarist, Greg Wolf, and we toured with the Boston Flamenco Ballet, doing school shows all through the United States. When the tour was over, I told Greg that I needed a break from Los Angeles because of all I had been going through, and I needed to get away from the drug scene because I knew that was not good for me. So he had a girlfriend in Vancouver, and he said, well, why don't you come and hang out in Vancouver with me? Well, to take a week off or a month off or whatever. So that was the plan. There was no, I'm going to move to Canada. I just came for a holiday. And as the story goes, I'm still here. Because I met artists and musicians. I fell in love. Eventually I fell out of love with that person. But I had developed community with the local musician. There was a very lively music and art scene in Vancouver at that time. And it was pre the World's Fair that came to Vancouver in Expo that came to Vancouver in 1986. And all of this was kind of leading up to that, unbeknownst to me, but that's what was happening. And the more I stayed, the more I performed with these people, the more they wanted me to stay with them. And eventually, people who were studying flamenco from another teacher, Angel Monson, who had been here way before I had been, found out about me and asked me if I would teach them. So I said sure. So I did. I taught them for a while, but I always had to go back to Los Angeles because I had work commitments, contracts to fulfill with the Los Angeles City School System, and there was another group organization that I worked for. So I divided half my time working in Los Angeles and part of my time teaching and working out of Vancouver. And eventually I got my landed status in Vancouver in 1986, and I've been here ever since. When I came to Vancouver in 1983, there was only one female flamenco dancer that I met. Her name was Jocelyn Chouinard. She went by the name of Joselina, and she produced a couple of the very first concerts that I did with Greg, Jose Lara, Joselina, and myself. She was very capable as a producer and was very motivated to produce these shows. In time, she and I brought in other artists from the Seattle area. One was a dancer, La Romera, and the other was a guitarist, Gerardo Alcalá, who is still here in Vancouver and very much a part of the flamenco scene. Jocelyn eventually decided to focus more on her belly dance career, and so she eventually started touring the world, both as a teacher and as a performer. She was a wonderful performer, as belly dancer, and a lovely Spanish flamenco dancer. The other people that I worked with in Vancouver in the late 80s, early 90s was Victor Colsti, who was a flamenco guitarist. He had just gotten back from Spain, so I had gigs at some of the local restaurants. So he played along with Jose Lara as the singer. And Angel Juarez also joined us for some of these performances. Angel lived in Gibson, so it was not easy for him to come down to do shows. But because he worked on the ferries, he had a free passage to Vancouver. So it made it a little bit easier for him to come and sing for some of our shows. Eventually, Rosario also came to Vancouver from Madrid with her new baby. And Victor, Rosario, and myself performed, and with Jose Lara, in some of these local venues, Barcelona, Pepitas. I think he might have done the classical joint with us, if I'm not mistaken. And eventually, both Victor and Gerardo, Rosario, Romera, Jose, and myself did some concerts together. So we were all kind of creating flamenco, the flamenco scene here in Vancouver in the late 80s, early 90s. Eventually, Rosario and Victor decided to create their own entity, Centro Flamenco, and so it has been a big part of the flamenco community scene for many years, including their flamenco festival that they present annually. The other guitarist that I worked with in Vancouver in the late 80s, early 90s was Andre Thibault. And he was a very accomplished guitarist. He's still a very accomplished guitarist. He plays different styles of music, and flamenco was just one of them. He participated in the 20th anniversary performance with Rosario, Victor, and myself at the Arts Club Backstage Lounge Theater. And he also played in a classical piece that I choreographed, the Miller's Dance from the Three-Cornered Hat. So he's on that recording. And he's a wonderful person to work with, has always been very supportive of my efforts, and he is still going. One advantage that I believe I had over other flamenco artists, and we'll say namely guitarists and singers, is that I made my living at teaching flamenco, because I could teach large groups of people in having several classes during the week, and that's how I made my living. In fact, if I look back on it, it was the teaching that has kept me gainfully employed through all these years. The performance has been just a percentage of my income, because performing can be very sporadic. You can have a run of tablao shows or restaurant shows in a few months, or you may do a concert here or there. but the days of touring are gone, so of course you can't do that anymore. But I've always managed to keep my teaching quite active, and even to this day I still teach. I teach more one-on-one, and I do more coaching, but I do have one general class that I teach. So I've been very lucky that the teaching has kept me financially afloat. The way I feel about teaching is that I really enjoy teaching, and the reason I enjoy teaching is both to teach flamenco and flamenco art and all of that goes with flamenco, but I enjoy teaching people how to learn, and it just so happens that I use flamenco as the medium. I became aware of a book in the late 70s, I believe. It's called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain by Betty Edwards. And she mentions in the book about some of the first experiments that were going on in California with split brain patients who had bouts of epilepsy. And they decided to try a treatment which is to cut the corpus callosum part of the brain to see how that would affect their seizures. And they discovered that we had not only one brain but two brains, and that each side of the head of the brain had a specific function that that was better for doing certain things. Now they've discovered a lot more, and the simplistic view that they had then, of course, has changed. But what has not changed is the fact that we have different areas of the brain that do different functions, and if you have a stroke or a problem with your brain, the other half of the brain can be taught to learn the function that the other side of the brain can no longer do. So this led me to an awareness of how do we see, how do we learn, how do we pick up information. And I got very much involved with that, and I eventually developed a program or a teaching methodology that I call CAL, Cognitive Awareness Learning. That simply means learning how to learn. Because if you think about it, we are not taught how to learn. We're just given the information like facts, and we're expected to absorb the information whichever way we do learn information. And that could be very time consuming and very frustrating for people who learn a certain way but are being given the information this other way. For example, people who come to dance class who are learning a routine or a pattern, sometimes those individuals like the things counted out for them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, for example. Well, other people, counting confuses them. So, but you can use onomatopoeia to say the same number of sounds, but by using ta 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 ta. That makes sense to some people. For other people, they're more visually oriented in the sense that they don't want to hear me count it out. They don't want to hear me say the rhythm. They just want to see me do it. Do it and do it facing me or do it with your back to me makes a difference to some people. I had one student who was dyslexic, and she couldn't see me in the mirror to learn her step. She had to see me from the side in this direction in order to get the step. So that's what I mean about people having different ways of learning. And in my opinion, this way cuts out frustration and it speeds up the learning process. I really enjoy my students because they bring to my world a whole different outlook on life. And as I teach a lot of seniors nowadays, we share life stories, and we have a lot of fun. We laugh a lot, but we're serious in the work that we do. But we don't take it so seriously that they get frustrated or they leave frustrated. We take it seriously enough to have integrity for what we're learning and to learn it properly. Like I have one student right now who is learning bulerias. She thought she would never learn to do bulerias because it was too complicated and complex for her. But now that I've broken down the pieces into little chunks, she gets it. And she finally can say, I can dance bulerias. Well, that's a huge hurrah for me, because it brought joy to her life and it brings joy to my life. So yes, I really enjoy people. In fact, before I teach classes, especially private classes, I always run through my head, what can I teach them today that is going to add to their piece of knowledge that we taught the last class? Or what can I revisit that we have been struggling with, struggling with for the last few weeks, to get them to move beyond a certain place. And so a lot of that comes back to teaching people how to learn.
I found that what you did was you would look at a student and you get to know them over a couple of classes, and then you start to teach that person in the style that they needed. For myself, I am a counter. Mm-hmm. So I found that you would count things out for me, but there were other students who counting drove them nuts. Right. So you'd sing the melody, da 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 dee da da dee da dee da, right? And for me, I'd be going 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 5, da 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 da, you know. So I responded to the fact that you would adapt your teaching styles to the students and their needs.
Right.
And that was an inspiration.
Well, that was something that I consciously took on, because when I was in school, I was terrible. I would get terrible grades in math and in English and in those type of subjects. But I realize now it was because I wasn't being taught the way I learned.
That's right.
And had they taught me the way I learned, I would have done much better in school. So I remembered that. And as I've gotten more into teaching, I am really aware, or I try to make the information, in this case flamenco, more accessible to people who may not have a musical background or a dance background, but they love this art form.
And another thing that you did is you never made anybody feel that they couldn't get it. Mm-hmm. You would encourage them, and you would work one-on-one with them and things like this. So that was a very positive environment to learn flamenco in.
Great.
I didn't have to go out and drink wine to get through it. Though I do like to drink wine. You know, sometimes you just get so wrapped up, and I'm quite an intense person.
Yes.
So I get all wrapped up, and then you talk me through it, and we get there. So, you know, that was one of the joys of the classes.
Well, talking about drinking wine, the first class that I took in Jerez with Ana Maria Lopez, it was a bulería class, and lo and behold, there were the ladies passing around a glass of sherry, something to chips to eat while you're doing the class, and sitting there smoking their cigarettes while they're learning bulerías. And I thought, now this is the way to learn.
This is the way to learn. Exactly.
I could have done without the smoke, but
it's so true.
They were having a good time.
And that's the way it should be. You should have a good time, have some laughs, enjoy yourself, you know.
Right.
It's great.
Yeah. For myself, I think that started with my mother, who was always welcoming to outside people into our house. My father also was this is a side story, but it's related to inclusivity. He was working in construction, and he had a friend who was black, African American, but at that time they were referred to as black. Mm-hmm. He invited him over to the house for dinner, and our neighbors, Mexican neighbors, called him on it.
Oh!
Why did you bring that guy over to your house? And he said, because he's a friend of mine. And my father was that way. He didn't care what anybody else thought. He was going to do what he wanted to do. When I asked my mother if I should come up here to Vancouver after having visited and thought about moving up here, she said, there's one way to find out. Do it. And I think that's what inspired me to, when people would come to me that might not have dance background, might be older, might be out of shape, if they wanted to learn flamenco, welcome. I think that goes back also to my apprenticeship and work with Lola Montes, because she took girls and fellas from the East LA area, barrio, and included them in her company. And she developed a strong core of dancers that she toured for many, many years. Our academy is 20 years old, Mozaico Flamenco Dance Academy, and Mozaico Flamenco is 50 years old. And this business about legacy actually started when I started my first research when I went to Spain in 1998 on a Canada Council grant to study the evolution and revolution in flamenco and Spanish dance, flamenco primarily. And then I realized when I was in Spain that I had in Lola Montes, who was in California, a great repository of information and history. So that's when I started to interview her. And as I got more interviews with her and former company members and so forth, I realized the importance of legacy. So that's where I started to, this seed was planted about leaving a legacy. Who leaves a legacy and why do you leave a legacy? Well, Lola didn't realize that she was important in the chain of Spanish dancers that were in the United States when she started dancing, like Carmen Amaya and Antonio Triana, Argentinita, Pilar Lopez, Rosario and Antonio were all in New York City when Lola was in New York City. So she, like she said, Spain came to me, I didn't have to go to Spain. Well, she transplanted that to California, and then she transplanted that to us, the Los Angelinos, and then eventually I transported that up here to Canada, not knowing at the time that that's what was going to happen. And now we are continuing this legacy primarily through the work of Cassandra, that she has taken upon herself this huge task of getting monies from the Canada Council and BC Arts Council to document this information for future generations. Because as Lola and I used to say, when Lola's gone, Lola, when you're gone, that information is gone and you can't retrieve it. So while I'm still here, more or less clear of mind, I would like to help in this maintaining of this legacy. When I first started out, I was a dancer and I wanted to dance. I actually started teaching at a very young age. I was around 18, and eventually that was my main way of making a living through teaching. But I performed and taught at the same time and period of my life. Well, when I got into my late 50s, my body changed, my mind changed, my directions changed, and I think I unknowingly started to develop classes, and eventually Cassandra came into my life, and she is part of my legacy. And because of health issues and age, I have cut back on my performing as a dancer, although I still perform as a singer, and I'm there to support our growing our students. But now I am focused more, I think, on my legacy, what I'm going to be leaving, and of course, as I said earlier, Cassandra is a big part of it. But I think most people go through those changes. At one stage of your life, you're this. At another stage of your life, you're that, and so forth. So I'm at the latter part of my dance career. I've been watching videotapes of myself as I'm going through our videos through the years, and I think, well, that was pretty good. That was pretty good. But now I really enjoy teaching people how to perfect or refine their skills, their technical skills, so that then they can apply it to choreographies that either Cassandra or I might help them with. So that's where I'm at. Because when I was starting out, and the first time I went to Spain, they didn't teach us about the cante. The cante was kind of there, but that was certainly not the focus in the dance classes. And through the years, I became more aware of the cante. And I think teachers all over the world have actually become more aware of the importance of the cante. Well, she came into my life at a very unique stage of my career. I would say I was probably at the apex of my dance life. I was in my early 50s, late 40s. And she came up, started taking classes with me. And within a year or two, I could see that she was really moving along quite quickly. And before you knew it, she was teaching, and then she was choreographing.
And she was performing a keynote.
That's
where I saw her the first time.
That's right. And she was the one who was after me to create a school. We have to create an entity. So eventually I came around and I said, sure, let's do the school. So we created the school, of which she is the owner, and I have my name as the artistic director. And we also created Mozaico Flamenco Dance Theater, where we did a few productions. And it's been a marvel to see her growth. And one of the advantages that she has that a lot of other artists don't have is that she has a business mind and an artistic mind. I knew that Cassandra was better at it than I was because I'm more artistically minded. That being said, I remember that Lola used to tell me when I was in her company, remember that what we are doing is a business, and you have to know about contracts, about commitment to contracts to the producers, and don't forget, it's about business. It's not just the dance. So I carried that in my head. So when Cassandra and I began to get together, and I could see that she had a business sense and a business background, that she would probably be ideal for keeping this thing going. And she has.
Oscar, when you think about your long career, which students stand out in your head?
Robert Benarroya went on to create Caravan World Rhythms, an organization that promotes all types of ethnic dance troupes, right?
World music.
World music.
World music and also world dances.
Right. There has been, Kirill is another person that I think has a lot of potential. There was Shang, there is Michelle, who has been assisting me in my classes for many years. Let me see, who else did? Kelty has been instrumental in working with programs on the east side of Vancouver. And
Leah
Granger.
Leah Granger has developed her own group and is now in Toronto. So she's also coming up very nicely. So I feel very proud that I was able to help create some of these people's path towards their goals.
So I was working at BC Hydro at the time, doing marketing of energy exports to the States, and I'd already had an interest in possibly taking flamenco classes when I was living in Montreal, but I was too scared to start. And so I got to Vancouver and I was at this job, and so I just called a couple of the dance schools in Rosario and Oscar, and so I called Oscar and we started talking, and somehow the issue of me being a Sephardic Jew came up, and I think he mentioned that he had some Sephardic blood, and right away we had this kind of personal connection happening, and he was like super warm and open and made it very comfortable for me to go and start taking classes.
Well, I remember that he was very keen and very interested and interesting. He was, you could talk about a lot of different things with him. He wasn't one-dimensional. And he actually took baile quite seriously there for a while.
One thing I forgot to mention was Teo Morca in Bellingham.
Oh, right.
And we'd go down for his summer intensive workshops, and he would come up as well to give classes. So he was also a big influence at the time on a certain portion of the flamenco community.
He had been living in LA with his wife, Isabel, and they decided they wanted to a quieter life. So they bought a property in Bellingham and they moved up here. And he used to have these summer workshops every August, which were really popular. And I had studied with Teo when he was in Los Angeles and when I was living in Los Angeles, and because I looked up to him as one of my older teachers. He was about a decade and a half older than I was, so, and he was considered more modern in his approach to flamenco dance.
His style was also very entertaining and performative,
Right.
at times humorous even, but also very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
He had these really strong hands, and he would point his two fingers out, and it was like, wow, like that presence he had on stage. Yeah. Same as a teacher. Actually, I was unfortunately there when his wife passed away.
Oh, you were there?
I was right there when she passed away.
Right.
It was we were watching them rehearse after class,
Right.
and she just like fainted gracefully on the floor,
Yeah.
and we didn't know what was going on, and yeah, that was it.
That was it. Yeah.
And then we thought Teo would cancel the whole workshop, but he said no, we go on. You gave a nice talk to everybody to,
Right.
just make us feel better, and we kept going on. But when we were doing Soleil after that,
Right.
and Gary was playing, and he was almost in tears, and everybody was almost in tears doing Soleil in that. And then you remember the place where she was very, at first, those few days right after, it was intense.
It was very intense, yeah. To watch somebody die while they're dancing,
So that was pretty intense.
that's heavy flamenco. That's about as sigidi as you can get, right? Well, and then Roberto, on his own initiative, you started to produce shows, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was great for me.
I think you might have asked me to help you with putting on a show with some guest artists that you knew, maybe from Seattle.
Okay.
And I already had started the Flamenco Club, but that was just to have some gatherings. But yeah, you're the one who said, hey, can you help me put on the show and help promote it? And so you actually were the one who, because you had some experience putting on shows,
Mm-hmm.
so you had a media list that you gave me to reach out to, and you kind of helped me to learn how to promote a show.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, and then, we went from there.
Right. And then you developed Caravan World Rhythms. Well, I thought that was the best thing that could happen because I didn't have the time nor the energy to do that. And he was young, he had the energy and the enthusiasm to start that. And how else is a person going to start without that media list and so forth? No, I was never threatened. Robert was always respectful and would always ask me, do you think this is good? Or what do you think? And so forth. So we had a very, I think, amicable relationship from the start. So no, I was never threatened by that. I thought it was a good thing, and it turned out to be the right choice because he went on and continued to produce productions and brought more people into the flamenco scene by presenting more productions. So, I mean, an artist can only do so much. You either are a good performer, a good teacher, a good promoter, but it's very difficult to do all three, as you well know, because it takes a lot of energy to especially if you're going to perform. It sucks it right out of you. So this was the best thing that could have happened to me.
Oscar's taught me a ton of things, but I think what is going to go down with me forever is your attitude of positivity and inclusion, and feeling like if you have the right state of mind, you can get through anything in life. Like you're more than a teacher to me, like more than a flamenco teacher to me.
Right.
You're more like a life mentor.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's something that I will always treasure that.
Thank you. Thank you. Likewise. Yeah.
Okay, well, I can add to that because I feel the same way. I really do. When I think about who are the people in my life who I want to be like, you are in that group of people.
Thank you.
And yeah, it's the inclusion, the way that you build community, and the way that you're so generous with yourself. You really draw the best out of people, and you build bridges within this community, and you have relationships with everyone in this community, good relationships, which says so much about you. And you bring humor, and that has always been, it's like you lead with humor and joy, and that carries, I think that has taught me so much about how to move through life and how to get through difficult things, and also how to celebrate good things.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Thank you both. Yeah.
Hugs are free.
Good.
I think one of the most interesting things about Oscar's career is that he has created leaders in the community and people that could actually take an idea, run with it, and see it through to fruition. Oscar, you know why that is? It's because you never said no to us. You never said no. And I think this is such an interesting thing because you didn't stop anybody from dreaming. So simply by not saying no, you allowed people to dream, you allowed people to incubate an idea. And he has a very long list of people that he has had in his career. Barnaz Ohadi, who is now a mover and shaker in Europe, living in Spain, who has created Farsi Flamenco, which is Persian language and poetry and song, along with flamenco. And you know why that is, Oscar?
Why?
Because many, many years ago, she had approached me to see if I thought it was a good idea to sing Persian lyrics or Persian poetry with Farsi language in my Sigadia class. And I didn't know about that. And I said, I don't know. Go talk to Oscar. And then you didn't say no.
Well, I've never believed in saying no because you won't know until you try. And a lot of people get stopped because of criticism or any number of things, ego, as you mentioned earlier. I don't think my ego is that big in terms of me. And I learned that from my mother. Don't be egotistical. And or what Lola used to tell me. She says, there are a lot of indispensable people in the cemetery. So I take myself and my career with a grain of salt because none of this was planned. It just happened. The same thing with Lola. It just happened. So as I went along and people started looking up to me for advice, I never felt I had the right to tell anybody, don't do that, because that you can kill an idea, right? So that's my feeling.
Today, Mozaico Flamenco is actually multiple entities. Mozaico Flamenco Dance Academy Limited is the dance academy that was incorporated in 2002. Mozaico Flamenco Dance Theater, we actually haven't had a dance company in many, many years, but we had two incarnations in it. Two incarnations of Mozaico Flamenco Dance Theater in the year 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006. And then I had a couple of kids, and then we had another company in 2008, 10-ish.
When did you
And
do
we
that?
actually haven't had a dance company since. Mozaico Flamenco is a catch-all term for the intergenerational multicultural artistic group that is also LGBTQ2IA. And that actually includes all the singers and guitarists and dancers that we hire for all of our shows.
Mm-hmm.
We have Los Mosaicos, and this is our volunteer arm that goes out to perform for multicultural events around town. That includes intermediate and advanced students, but also professionals as well.
Right.
It's a mix.
Uh-huh.
And then Cassandra Flamenco is a whole other thing.
That's right.
Cassandra Flamenco is a whole other thing.
Well, and I think that's a good thing too, because when you told me that you were going to create Cassandra Flamenco, I wasn't threatened, because why shouldn't you do Cassandra Flamenco? And your reasonings behind it were solid enough that I thought, well, she's growing and she's got to go in a direction that is comfortable for her. That was what drew us together to take class at Belvedere Gym, because we all knew we were gay. And it's funny, I can't remember a time when we actually addressed it as, oh, he's gay, he's gay, he's gay. Because I don't think we used that term until I was in my early 20s, when it really became a catch-all word, catchword for anybody who was gay. But at that time, we were in high school, I think. And we just kind of gravitated towards each other, and they and I started to found out about Mrs. Aguilar's classes, and we, as a group, we all went there, and that helped us to stick together and fight the prejudice that was surrounded us in the barrios in East LA. There was a lot of machismo in the barrios at that time. And when I say we used to run the gauntlet of beer bottles and rocks, I mean that literally. Mm-hmm. I remember having to run to the gym and slam the door shut, and the guys would be beating on the door and say, "Come out of there, faggot. We're going to beat you up when you get out of class." But we were inside in a safe environment. So it was okay then. And with Mrs. Aguilar, she knew, but it was cool. I mean, it was something that you didn't talk about. Mm-hmm. And like I told, my mom told me, it wasn't that I objected to you being gay, it was that it was illegal. Mm-hmm. Right. And you could be arrested. And that was her fear. Mm-hmm. I think that's what in a indirect way gave me the strength to carry on and to push through. Because if you can survive that kind of an upbringing, mm-hmm. you can pretty much survive anything. Mm-hmm. Because when it starts when you're a little kid, mm-hmm. then you have a big hill to climb or mountain to climb. Mm-hmm. And if you can reach a summit of one mountain, then you can probably go on to the next mountain, right? And mm-hmm. that's been my experience. So that's part of what I leave behind. Mm-hmm. Well, by the time I'd gotten to Vancouver, things had really changed in the world. And of course I had matured, and it wasn't as difficult as it had been in Texas, and California was easier, but it still had its prejudices. And so growing up in a closeted world really brings its own baggage with it. And I'm not alone in that. Anybody, whether you're female or you're male or you're transgender, has that struggle, because it's a straight world, basically, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And so you're always fighting against the stream. And when you do break out and find your own path, it's very gratifying. And like you say, at least in the last 20 or so years, that whole issue has come up, has opened up, and people like Manuel Lignon dancing in skirts. But in the 90s, with the shirtless
Joaquin Cortez.
Joaquin Cortez, when he showed up on stage with a bata de cola, it was like, what? A man in a bata de cola? That takes balls, right? And then, of course, in the female side, Rocio Molina and other women that have come out, and it's okay. We can talk about it. It's no longer in the closet, but it can feel very closeted and claustrophobic when you've grown up with that. Because I think about that, especially now at this age, all the ridicule and the put downs, including my father, that I had to endure, but I persisted, as we all know, and now we're in a different space. But it's still not totally safe out there in the world. There are pockets of real hostile people that don't want this thing to. Well, look at what's happening with the transgender and the drag queens in the United States. So many laws are being enacted to prohibit them from speaking their piece, and because people are afraid, for whatever reason they're afraid. So it's a battle that we have to continuously fight.
I think for me, being queer, that was big. Like, I didn't necessarily see myself reflected in the flamenco art form because I saw it as being very gendered and frankly very straight, and I just wasn't, I didn't realize what a rich history of queer people and performers existed in flamenco, and I didn't realize that you could play with gender and that there was room for that in the community. And I think, Oscar, you made me feel safe in that way, because it was with you that I was first exploring, well, maybe I want to be like Carmen Amaya and dance in pants, and and maybe I can, pursue expressing myself in a different way through this art form, and I don't have to conform to this particular this particular dynamic. So you were really, I think you were really important for me. It really mattered a lot to me that you were a leader in this community.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, it's important because, like it can feel very isolating.
Yeah.
And once you've broken through that and you realize, well, I'm not any different than that person, except my preferences in certain aspects of my life. But we're all the same.
Yeah.
We're all people who have dreams, who have aspirations, and we struggle to reach our goals, and sometimes we fail and sometimes we make it, but we're all the same. Nobody's different, right? When you're young, everything is possible. So when she put out her plans to do a queer show, I said, right on, go for it. And then she dragged me kicking and screaming into the project. And I thought, good for her. Because when I was young, there was no way I could have done that. And even accepting what I was, it culturally just was not acceptable. But she lives in an environment where that is accepted as part of her artistic path. So I give her a lot of credit for taking that on. It was scary for me because it was part of my own self-homophobia that is very typical of older generation gay, lesbian people, that we harbor this closeted, we live in this closet for so many years that when we open the door, even just a little bit, it's, there's light out there, there's people out there, what's going to happen, so it's threatening. So it was a fight, a struggle for me to keep it together in that performance.
And you did, and it was so beautiful what you offered.
So emotional.
It was a really, really special night, and for me too.
Yeah.
It was really special to be part of that with the two of you.
Yeah. In 2008, I was diagnosed with colon cancer. That was removed. Then in
2010 they had to reconnect me because I had to wear a bag for a couple of years. And then in 2014 they reconnected, or they fixed a hernia that I had for a number of years that was a result of the first operation. Then in around 2014 I was diagnosed with AFib, atrial fibrillation, which is erratic heartbeat. And then in 2015 I was diagnosed with Parkinson's. Well, welcome to life. Parkinson's has been a real journey. Obviously, I don't think there's anything necessarily good about Parkinson's, but the good that I try to make out of it is to try and keep a positive outlook on life. I started my Parkinson's first started as a tremor in my left hand, and it's called the resting tremor, because when I'm resting is when the tremor starts. So I now take medications for that. But the medications have a side effect, which is oftentimes dystonia, which is the body moving involuntarily. It also affects my cognition, and a component of Parkinson's is what they say are Lewy body disease cells, which can create dementia. So there are several levels to this progression of this disease. At this stage of my life, I think I'm doing fairly well, and I believe it's the dance and the dancing that is helping me, because when I dance and when I do movement, the tremor stops, and it creates, it helps with balance issues, which is a big part of Parkinson's. And I've given a few workshops on people with Parkinson's, and we do exercises in rhythm, in clapping, in arm movements, in standing up, doing marking steps. So all of this has really helped those people that were doing the workshop, and what they found that it was fun also because of the music. So for me, Parkinson's is not a death sentence. It's a manageable disease that it's a progressive disease, there's no doubt about that. But like the colon cancer, nowadays people who have cancer can have a life post-cancer because it's a manageable disease. So the same thing with Parkinson's. I manage it, and I believe I'm doing fairly well. Now, what in the future does this hold for me? Nobody can say. I can only say that I hope I live a few more years, maybe 10, 15, if I'm lucky, 20 years. And maybe by then they will have discovered more ways of reducing the effects of Parkinson's. You never know what's around the corner. So I try and keep a positive attitude in my life and in my lifestyle, and I try to pass that positive attitude to my students, because to tell you the truth, nobody likes a whiner. Sometimes I get together with my peers of my old age, and we laugh and we say, here we go with our organ recital. We talk about our hearts, about our kidneys, about our liver, about our this, about our that. Sometimes when there are young people there sitting with us, I tell them, you must be bored to be hearing us old farts talk about their woes. But that's the reality of life. When I was 20, nothing like this could have crossed or entered my mind. When I was 40 and 50, I was still in the prime of my life. And then as I aged, things start to happen. And that happens to everybody. No matter who you are, no matter how wealthy you are, something is going to change in your body. So be prepared for it and keep a positive attitude. Don't let the boogeyman get you down. For me, tolerance is the acceptance of other people from other cultures coming into flamenco, and to tolerate different ideas and not put
those ideas down because I think differently. We grew up in a racist country, and Mexicans, Jews, and dogs were not allowed in certain restaurants when we were traveling from Texas to California. And that really showed me, or us, that how intolerant some people are towards other people. And that probably planted a seed in my little brain that was something that I was not going to harbor in my way of thinking, that I would be more tolerant of even the bigoted people, because you have to know your enemy in order to get beyond a certain place. You can't harbor hate towards your enemy, because that only eats you up. And so when you tolerate bigotry, not to accept it, but to tolerate it as an entity, to tolerate somebody who disagrees with you on how flamenco is or should be, is my way of accepting that there are different ways to look at the world, not just my way. Never give up, and don't let anybody tell you that you can't do it because you're this or because you're that, or because you're too tall or too fat or too short, or you're not the right ethnicity. It doesn't matter. If it's in your heart and you really want to do it, do it. Don't let anybody tell you you can't do it.